Welcome back. In this lesson, we are going to clear up one of the biggest sources of confusion for grade 12 history learners: message, usefulness, reliability, and limitations, better known as MURL. If you have ever wondered why you keep losing marks even though your answers seem correct, this tutorial is for you. By the end of the lesson, you will know exactly what the examiner is asking and how to answer confidently every time. So let's get started. Have you ever looked at a source-based question and thought, aren't messages, usefulness, reliability, and limitations all asking the same thing? You are not alone. Many learners lose easy marks because they mix up messages, usefulness, reliability, and limitations. They think the answers are the same and end up applying the wrong skill. Here is the thing. Message, usefulness, reliability, and limitations are not the same question wearing different uniforms. These four concepts are completely different. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to confidently tell the difference between them. Message asks, what is the source saying? Usefulness asks, what does the source do to help someone studying this topic? Reliability asks, can I trust it? Limitations asks, what's amiss or what's the weakness? Mix those up and you answer a reliability question with a message answer. And the marker simply can't give you the mark because you haven't answered the question that was actually asked. Once you understand what the examiner is actually asking, you will know exactly how to answer each question every single time. You will never confuse these four again. So let's build the model that keeps this straight permanently by using the MURL framework as the easiest way to remember these four concepts. Each letter reminds you what the examiner wants. M is for message. What is the source saying? This is an interpretation skill. You are not describing the picture or repeating what you can see written. You are explaining the overall idea or point the source is trying to communicate. U is for usefulness. How does the source help a historian or researcher? Don't think about what the source shows. Think about what it does for someone trying to understand a period in history. Ask yourself, what does this source do that makes it useful? Notice something important here. The examiner is not asking how you would use the source. They are asking what makes the source useful. In other words, what does the source do that helps someone understand the historical issue? This means your answer should focus mainly on the source because the source is the subject of the question, while the historian or researcher is the object of the question. So do not say, a historian can use this source too. Instead, say, this source is useful because it provides. Usefulness means what the source does, not what the historian does. Take note, when explaining usefulness, we describe what the source does, so we usually use an action verb ending in S because the source is singular. Possible action verbs and phrases include provides, reviews, shows, highlights, explains, illustrates, demonstrates, documents, amongst many others. R is for reliability. Can I trust it? What makes this source believable? Ask yourself, who made this source and why? That's the real test of trustworthiness. Things to consider include provenance, that is the origins. Who created the source? When was it created? Where was it created? Under what circumstances was it created? For example, the source may be reliable because it was written by a participant who witnessed the events. You should also consider purpose. Why was the source created? Was it meant to inform, persuade, promote, criticize, or influence? Take for example, the source may be less reliable because it was intended to persuade people to support a political viewpoint. Another thing to consider is perspective or bias. From whose point of view is the information presented? Does the source show prejudice or favor one side? An example can be, the source may be less reliable because it only presents the perspective of the government, and you have to name the government as a way of specifying. Another factor to consider is corroboration or cross-reference. Does the information agree with other sources and historical facts? The source is reliable because the information is supported by other historical evidence. A good example of how we use these factors to judge reliability is this extract from Harry Truman's speech. Looking at provenance, who created the source? It was created by Harry Truman, the US president. When was it created? It was delivered in 1947 during the early Cold War when the United States was increasingly concerned about the spread of communism. And finally, why was the source created? Truman was addressing Congress to persuade them to approve funds to provide assistance to Greece and Turkey. So this gives us a reason to question the reliability of the source, because Truman was trying to persuade Congress to support his policy. He had a reason to present the communist threat in a way that would strengthen his argument. He may therefore have emphasized or exaggerated the threat, making the source potentially less reliable. Since the goal of this tutorial is to simplify, we will not overload you with all the reliability factors, which are many. We will cover most of them in the follow-up video, focusing only on reliability. I know there is a learner asking now, what about it being a primary or a secondary source? The issue of the nature of the source should not be treated as a separate point standing on its own. It usually links to provenance and time of creation. The fact that a source is primary or secondary does not automatically make it reliable. You still need to consider provenance, purpose, and bias. Simply put, consider the following questions when looking at reliability. Who created it? Why was it created? Whose perspective is presented? Is there bias? When was it created? Who was it created for? Can it be confirmed by other sources? L is for limitations. What's missing, biased, weak, or flawed about it? Every source has strengths. Every source also has limitations. Limitations are simply the weaknesses or gaps that prevent the source from giving the complete picture. A very important point to note here is that many learners don't realize that these factors we have just discussed are not answers. They are thinking questions. They help you work out what kind of answer the examiner expects. If you answer the wrong thinking question, you will write a good answer to the wrong question, and unfortunately that still loses marks. One of the easiest ways to avoid mixing these concepts up is to begin your answer with a different sentence for each skill. Let's look at them one by one. For message, always begin with the message conveyed by the source is, then you state the message. For usefulness questions, begin with the source is useful because, then explain what exactly the source does, thereby making it useful. For reliability questions, begin with the source is reliable because, or the source may not be reliable because. And for limitations, begin with the limitation of the source is that. Let's lock this in with one table. Take note, all these 4 skills usually come with a 2x2 mark allocation each, meaning 2 answers needed for each question. Another important thing to keep in mind is the fact that when presenting your answers, you should never copy anything from the source, even if what is copied answers the question, because these are not skills for extraction questions. Instead, use your own words all the time when responding to questions that require these skills. Keep the image of the table in your head, because we are now going to test it on the actual DBE exam source. Our source today is source 1B from the actual November 2022 NSC History Paper 1. It's an extract from a speech delivered by American President Harry Truman to Congress on the 12th of March 1947, a speech that later became known as the Truman Doctrine. In it, Truman asks Congress to approve money and personnel to support Greece and Turkey so they can resist the spread of communism. He argues that poverty and hardships are what allow totalitarian regimes to take root, and he frames American support as a moral duty, protecting the free peoples of the world and keeping hope alive for a better life. This is ideal for practicing all 4 MURL skills, so let's get into it. Let's start with message. The question here is usually something like this. What messages are conveyed by the source? Never say the source shows. That phrase answers usefulness, not message, because it describes what the source does, not what it is saying. So saying a source shows something often becomes a description instead of interpretation. Saying the source shows is also a red flag for something else, copying the caption underneath the source. For example, if the caption says, the source below shows, many learners simply repeat that wording. that is, extraction. A message question requires interpretation. The examiner wants to know what the source is communicating, not what it literally displays. Instead, always begin with the message conveyed by the source is, and then you state the message in your own words. Look at the line about totalitarian regimes being nurtured by misery and want, and growing in the evil soil of poverty and strife. Truman isn't just describing communism. He is linking it directly to poverty and positioning American aid as the cure. So a strong message answer should be, the message conveyed by the source is that poverty and hardships create the conditions for communism to spread, and that the United States has a responsibility to support struggling nations like Greece and Turkey in order to stop this from happening by protecting democracy and global stability. Alternatively, the message could be expressed more simply by saying, the message conveyed is that the USA intended to stop the expansion of communist influence into other countries by providing financial and military aid. Another way of expressing the same message is, the message conveyed is that America was willing to provide economic and military support to nations under communist pressure. Or if we are to focus on the main underlying idea, we would say, harsh living conditions and economic hardship create opportunities for communist systems to gain support. Notice, I didn't copy Truman's exact wording. I explained in my own words what he is actually arguing, and this is good practice because it shows interpretation. Next up is usefulness. You will usually see this with the command word comment, like, comment on the usefulness of this source to a historian studying the origins of the Cold War. Start your answer with, the source is useful because, then give the reason. That is, what the source does, thereby rendering it useful. Don't say, I will get to use it to, or the researcher will use it to. The question isn't asking how someone will use it. It's asking why it's a valuable piece of evidence. We should not forget including our action verbs, since what makes a source useful is what it does. A strong usefulness answer will be, the source is useful because it reveals how Truman justified American intervention to Congress, using both moral arguments and cost framing, giving historians direct insight into how the US government publicly built support for its Cold War containment policy. We could make this answer more concise and focus on the broader policy and say, the source is useful because it provides information on the USA's policy of preventing the spread of communism during the early Cold War period. We could narrow the focus even further and identify the specific action the USA was prepared to take. So we say, the source is useful because it highlights that the USA intended to provide economic and military support to countries threatened by communist influence. Or we could approach the source from another useful angle and focus on what it reveals about American concerns. And we say, the source is useful because it reveals American fears about the expansion of communism and the reasons for US involvement in international affairs. Quite often, the learners simply state that the source is useful because it is a primary source. It is an eyewitness account. It is a speech. This will not earn any marks, as it does not tell us what the source does to render it useful. Don't simply state the source type. You have to go further and state what it does. We need to see that action verb as explained earlier. Look at the following answer as an example of how we go further than just stating what the source is by including what the source does. The source is useful because it is a speech by President Truman and therefore provides a first-hand American perspective on events that contributed to the origins of the Cold War. The answer does not simply state that it is a speech by President Truman. It goes further to state what it does and hence the action verb provides. Sometimes the question will already tell you it is useful and just ask how. Like, explain in what way the source is useful. It doesn't matter. The same template still works, or just drop straight into the reason. That is, stating what the source does which makes it useful. As explained earlier in this tutorial, the subject is the source. At no point did we say, I can use this source, or the researcher will use this source. The examiner is not asking who uses the source. They are asking what the source does that makes it useful. Do you see how answers to usefulness are different from message conveyed? If not, go back and look at the template and answers to message and then compare with the template and answers to usefulness. Now, the one that learners fear the most, reliability. Our template to start our answer is, the source is reliable because, or the source may not be reliable because. Here is the mental shortcut. Reliability is really just asking, can I trust it? That is, trustworthiness. To answer this properly, ask yourself 3 questions about the speech. Who is speaking? Who is he speaking to? And why is he saying this? Truman is the sitting US president, speaking directly to Congress, asking them to approve funding and military personnel. He needs Congress on his side, so the emotional and moralistic language about hope and the free peoples of the world isn't neutral description. It paints Soviet Russia as an imminent threat. It's persuasion aimed at getting a specific outcome, that is, the approval of the aid package. Earlier, when we were explaining the usefulness of source 1b, we said the source is useful because it reveals how Truman justified American intervention to Congress using both moral arguments and cost framing, giving historians direct insight into how the US government publicly built support for its Cold War containment policy. The stated use of cost framing can make us question the reliability of the source. Cost framing means making a cost look small or worthwhile by changing how it is presented. In this extract, Truman frames the cost of assisting Greece and Turkey as extremely small by comparing it with the much larger American investment. He states that the required figure amounts to little more than 1/10 of 1% of this investment, highlighting money saved rather than money spent, instead of focusing on the actual amount of money being requested. Truman presents it as a tiny fraction of a much larger amount. This makes the proposed financial assistance seem insignificant and affordable. He then reinforces this with, it is only common sense. This makes supporting the aid appear obvious and financially sensible rather than a costly or controversial decision. Ultimately, Truman's use of cost framing may limit the reliability of the source because he presents the financial assistance as a very small proportion of a much larger investment, which could make the proposed policy appear more affordable and reasonable than it might otherwise seem. So our possible answers to the question will be as follows. If you consider the source to be unreliable, you can start by looking at whose perspective it presents. The source may be less reliable because it presents only the American perspective and omits the views of the Soviet Union. We notice that the source comes from an American side of the Cold War. That tells us that we are hearing one side of a conflict involving competing interests. Because the Soviet perspective is absent, the source may give us one-sided understanding of the situation. Therefore, we have a reason to question whether it gives us the complete or balanced picture. We can reach a similar judgment by looking at what Truman was trying to achieve. The source may be less reliable because Truman's purpose was to persuade Congress to support American foreign policy, which could result in bias or exaggeration of the communist threat. Here we looked at what Truman was trying to achieve by making the speech. He was not simply recording what was happening, he was trying to convince Congress to support his proposed policy. This gives him a reason to present the situation in a way that would strengthen his argument. That could mean emphasizing the danger posed by communism or portraying the situation as more urgent than it actually was. This gives us a reason to question the reliability of his claims. We can also take that same idea a step further by considering Truman's political position and the specific outcome he wanted. The source may not be fully reliable because Truman, as president, had a direct political motive to convince Congress to approve financial and military aid, meaning the speech is a persuasive appeal rather than a neutral account of the situation in Greece and Turkey. In this answer, we considered Truman's position and what he wanted Congress to do. As president, he had a political interest in securing support for his foreign policy proposal. Because the source was created to win support for a particular course of action, we cannot necessarily expect Truman to present every aspect of the situation equally. His political objective could influence what he emphasized, what he downplayed, and how he described the threat. This creates a possible weakness in the source reliability. But remember, reliability questions can be argued in both directions. The same source can contain features that make us question its reliability, while other features make it reliable for particular purposes. For example, instead of focusing on Truman's political motive, we can focus on his position as president and say, the source is reliable because it is a speech by President Truman, a key participant in events surrounding the Cold War, and therefore provides a first-hand account of American policy. In this answer, we considered who created the source and his position at the time. Truman was not an outsider commenting on American policy years later. He was the US president responsible for shaping that policy. This means he had direct knowledge of the decisions and intentions of American government. Therefore, if we want to know what the US government intended to do, Truman is a valuable first-hand source. Notice that this does not mean Truman must be completely truthful about everything he says. His position makes him particularly reliable to better understand American policy and intentions. We can also support the reliability of the source by looking at when it was produced. And our answer would sound like this. The source is reliable because it was produced during the early Cold War period, making it a contemporary source reflecting events at that time. In this answer, we looked at when the source was produced in relation to the events being discussed. Truman was speaking while these developments were actually unfolding, rather than many years later relying on memories or information gathered afterwards. This means the source provides contemporary evidence of how the situation was understood and presented at the time. Therefore, it can be considered reliable for understanding the attitudes and concerns of the period. Again, however, being contemporary does not automatically make everything in the source accurate. It simply gives us a reason to regard the source as reliable evidence. So from these answers, what have we just done? We haven't simply named factors such as perspective, purpose, provenance, or time. We have identified a clue about the source, considered what that clue tells us, and then explained how it affects our judgment about reliability. Do you see how these answers for reliability are different from message and usefulness? Finally, let's look at limitations. Let's not forget our template to start the answers. The limitation of the source is that the big rule here is that for a strong answer, don't use negatives like does not, as in the source does not. Instead, identify what the source contains that weakens it. Identify an existing weakness in the source rather than simply listing missing information. Because a limitation question asks learners to identify weaknesses which are present in the source, that reduces its value, not merely information that is absent. Answers with does not are often weak, although markers can reluctantly tolerate them. Don't just say it's biased or it's one-sided and stop there. State exactly what the source does or provides that makes it limited and explain further. Our broad answer thus becomes, the limitation of the source is that it only presents the American government's perspective and omits how the people of Greece or Turkey experienced the situation, or how the Soviet Union responded to Truman's claims, meaning it cannot give a complete picture of the events of 1947. We could make this answer more focused by identifying the specific problem created by that perspective. The source is limited because it presents the American viewpoint, which may result in a one-sided interpretation of the Cold War tensions. But perspective is not the only weakness we can identify. We can also look at what Truman was trying to achieve. The source is limited because Truman aimed to gain support for American foreign policy, which may have affected the objectivity of the information presented. We can take that idea further by looking at how this purpose may have influenced the content of the source itself. So our answer can be, the source is limited because it portrays communism as a major threat, which could lead to exaggeration or selective presentation of information. Alternatively, we can identify a broader weakness by considering whose interests the source represents. So we can say in our answer, the source is limited because it only reflects the political interests and objectives of the United States government during the Cold War period. That's a full explained limitation, not just a label. Notice that these are different ways of identifying a limitation. We are not simply listing what the source leaves out. We are identifying something about the source itself that creates a weakness, and then explaining how that weakness reduces its value. From this tutorial, we have learned 4 different skills questions, 4 different templates to start our answer with. The same 4 steps apply to every single source, every single topic: Cold War, Angola, the Civil Rights Movement, internal resistance, the TRC, globalization. The topics change, but these 4 skills don't. Now it's your turn. Pause the video right now. Using the templates we just covered, practice answering the questions to message, usefulness, and reliability. Possible answers to the questions are as follows. This is not a complete list of the answers. There are other possible answers which might as well be correct. The question on messages conveyed, which reads, what messages are conveyed by the source regarding the spread of communism in Europe? 2 possible answers are, the message conveyed is that the spread of communism in Europe would threaten the freedom and independence of countries, as many nations struggling to rebuild after World War II could fall under communist influence. Another answer would be, the message conveyed is that the spread of communism would create instability and have far-reaching effects across Europe and beyond, making immediate intervention necessary to prevent its expansion. For the usefulness question, the question reads, explain why this source would be useful to a researcher investigating the Truman Doctrine. Our answers can be, the source is useful because it explains Truman's views and concerns about the spread of communism in Europe and why the USA felt intervention was necessary. The second answer can be, the source is useful because it outlines the policies and strategies that formed part of the Truman Doctrine, including economic and military assistance to Greece and Turkey. The reliability question reads, evaluate the reliability of the source for a historian investigating the nature of the communist threat in Greece and Turkey in 1947. Our possible answers can read like this. The source is reliable for understanding American government attitudes and intentions because it was delivered by President Truman himself, who was directly involved in shaping U.S. foreign policy. The second answer can be, the source is reliable because it is a reflection of the official stance and policies of the United States government regarding the perceived communist threat, as Truman was the leader of the USA and directly involved in shaping these policies, and his words would reliably help understand the US government's position. If you consider that the source is not reliable, possible answers can be, the source may be partially reliable because Truman could have exaggerated the communist threat to persuade Congress to support aid to Greece and Turkey. Another answer can sound like this. The source may be less reliable because it presents the American government's perspective on the situation, giving a one-sided account of the threat and excluding the perspectives of those who opposed US policy. Attempt the limitations question and write your 2x2 answers in the comments below using the template. I will be hearting the best ones. Explain 2 limitations of Source 1b for a historian investigating the Truman Doctrine. It is important to note that each question we have looked at above contain a confinement or a focus which acts as a filter. Learners still need to identify messages, usefulness, reliability, and limitations of sources, but only those connected to the wording of the question. However, each confinement still allows several valid responses rather than trapping learners into a single idea. So next time you see a source in your exam, don't panic and start describing what you see. Pause. Ask yourself, is this asking for message, usefulness, reliability, or limitations? Then reach for the matching template. In the videos that follow, we will unpack each skill individually and apply it across all Grade 12 source-based topics so that you can recognize exactly what the examiners are looking for, regardless of which topic appears in your exam. They will address the said confinements or focuses. Keep practicing the MURL framework and these questions will become much easier. Remember, being fast in history isn't about rushing. It's about recognizing what the questions want, knowing exactly what you are looking for, and immediately applying the right skill. If you found this lesson helpful, like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next Masterclass exam sprint lesson.